When the first rescue team arrived at the village, they expected chaos. They expected people screaming for help, homes destroyed, perhaps the aftermath of an explosion or a landslide. Instead, what they found was something so disturbing that several investigators would later struggle to describe it. The village was almost perfectly intact. The houses were still standing. Cooking pots remained on the tables, as if dinner had only just ended. Doors had been left open. Clothes still hung outside to dry. At first glance, it looked like everyone had simply disappeared. Then, one of the rescuers noticed an elderly man lying just outside his front door. A few steps later, there was another body, then another. Inside one house, a mother was still holding her child exactly as she had the night before. In another, an entire family appeared to be asleep, except they would never wake up again. The rescuers continued walking through the village in complete silence, and with every house they entered, the same impossible scene repeated itself. There were no wounds, no blood, no broken furniture, no signs of panic, no evidence that anyone had tried to escape. Even the animals had died where they stood. Cattle lay scattered across the fields. Chickens never left their coops. Dogs remained beside the homes they had guarded for years. It was as if something invisible had drifted through the valley during the night, quietly taking every living thing with it before disappearing without leaving behind a single trace. As more investigators arrived, the questions only became more frightening. How could an entire community die overnight without anyone hearing screams or trying to flee? Why were the houses untouched? Why had some villages been devastated while others only a few kilometers away were almost completely unaffected? Every answer seemed impossible. Some believed they were looking at the aftermath of a secret chemical weapon. Others feared a deadly epidemic unlike anything medicine had ever seen. Military specialists, doctors, geologists, and scientists from different countries all arrived carrying sophisticated equipment, convinced they would quickly discover the cause. Instead, every new test only deepened the mystery. There was no radioactive contamination, no deadly bacteria, no poison in the water, no explosive residue. Every explanation collapsed one after another, leaving investigators with a terrifying possibility. Perhaps they were dealing with something the modern world had never encountered before. And that's what makes this story so extraordinary. Everything you've heard so far actually happened. This isn't a legend passed down through generations, and it isn't the plot of a horror movie. Every major event in this story was documented by scientists, investigators, and eyewitnesses who stood in that valley and witnessed its aftermath with their own eyes. What you're about to hear is the true story of one of the strangest natural disasters ever recorded. A disaster so bizarre that if thousands of people hadn't seen its consequences, it would probably have been dismissed as fiction. But the most unbelievable part of this story wasn't what investigators found inside the village. It was what they eventually discovered waiting for them just beyond it. Only a short distance away rested a quiet mountain lake known as Lake Nyos. To anyone seeing it for the first time, it looked almost peaceful. Its dark blue water reflected the surrounding hills without the slightest hint of danger. Families had lived beside it for generations. Children played near its shores. Farmers depended on the fertile land around it to feed their families. On the evening of August 21st, 1986, life unfolded exactly as it always had. Parents called their children home for dinner. Smoke drifted slowly from cooking fires. Conversations filled the cool evening air before fading into another ordinary night. There were no warning signs, no strange smell, no unusual sound, nothing that suggested that beneath the calm surface of the lake, an invisible force had been building for years. While the entire valley slept peacefully, that force was finally about to break free. And before the sun rose again, it would erase more than 1,700 lives without a single explosion, without a single gunshot, and without giving almost anyone the chance to understand they were even in danger. As the investigation expanded, the valley slowly transformed into one of the most heavily studied disaster scenes in the world. Every new team arrived convinced they would finally solve the mystery. Yet, almost every theory collapsed within hours. Doctors searched for signs of an unknown disease, but found nothing that could explain so many deaths occurring almost simultaneously. Military experts considered the possibility of a chemical attack, but no known weapon behaved this way. Geologists inspected the surrounding mountains, expecting to find evidence of an eruption or a landslide powerful enough to release poisonous gases, yet the landscape appeared almost untouched. Every sample collected from the soil, every drop of water, every laboratory analysis seemed to eliminate another explanation. Instead of bringing answers, the evidence only deepened the mystery. The investigators weren't simply trying to understand how hundreds of families had died. They were beginning to question whether they truly understood the natural world as well as they believed. The survivors added even more confusion. Those who managed to escape described waking up with an unbearable heaviness in their chest, unable to breathe properly, their bodies refusing to respond as they tried to stand. Some remembered collapsing only a few steps outside their homes before losing consciousness again. Others spoke of finding parents, neighbors, and entire families lying peacefully in their beds, as though they had simply never awakened. What made these testimonies so unsettling was how ordinary everything had seemed only hours before. There had been no panic, no warning, no desperate attempt to flee. It was almost as if the disaster had arrived silently, while everyone slept and disappeared again before sunrise. Investigators soon noticed another strange detail. The lower parts of the valley had suffered the greatest number of deaths, while people who happened to be on higher ground had survived far more often. That pattern would become one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. Attention slowly turned toward the lake itself, not because anyone believed it had caused the disaster, but because it was the only feature in the landscape that scientists still couldn't fully explain. Lake Nyos was unlike most lakes. Hidden beneath its calm surface was a depth that few people appreciated, and even fewer had ever studied. Years earlier, geologists had already discovered that the region sat above ancient volcanic systems that, although inactive on the surface, were still releasing gases from deep inside the earth. Under normal circumstances, those gases escaped harmlessly into the atmosphere. But what if, somehow, this lake had been trapping them instead? At first, the idea sounded almost absurd. Water was supposed to support life, not become a weapon. Yet, with every passing day, the evidence kept pointing back toward the same place. The answers the scientists were looking for weren't scattered across the village. They were hidden beneath thousands of tons of perfectly still water. When research vessels finally began collecting samples from the deepest parts of the lake, something extraordinary appeared in the data. The deeper the instruments descended, the higher the concentration of dissolved carbon dioxide became. Not just a little more, enormously more. It was unlike anything most of the scientists had ever measured before. Layer after layer of deep water contained invisible gas trapped under immense pressure, almost like a gigantic bottle of champagne waiting for someone to remove the cork. Suddenly, the impossible began to sound frighteningly plausible. If something had disturbed those deep layers during the night, even for a few moments all of that gas could have escaped at once. And if that happened, it wouldn't rise harmlessly into the sky. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air. It would spill over the edge of the crater and flow downhill, silently following the valleys exactly where the villages had been built. For the first time since the disaster, the investigators finally had a theory that explained almost every mystery. It explained why there had been no explosions. It explained why the houses remained untouched. It explained why animals died alongside people. It even explained why those living on higher ground were more likely to survive. But one terrifying question still remained unanswered. If Lake Nyos had done this once, could it happen again? That question would force scientists to confront a reality far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The disaster wasn't simply an unpredictable tragedy. It revealed that nature had been quietly hiding a mechanism capable of killing thousands of people without warning. And there were reasons to believe Lake Nyos might not be the only place on Earth where such a catastrophe could occur. The more scientists learned about Lake Nyos, the more unsettling the truth became. This had not been a once-in-a-lifetime accident caused by extraordinary bad luck. It was the result of a process that had been unfolding silently for years, completely hidden beneath the surface of the lake. Every single day, tiny amounts of carbon dioxide had been rising from deep underground, released by ancient volcanic activity far below the Earth's surface. Instead of escaping into the atmosphere, the gas became trapped in the cold water at the bottom of the lake. Year after year, season after season, the pressure continued to build. The lake was quietly storing an invisible threat that no one living nearby could possibly have detected. There was no smell, no change in the color of the water, no unusual sound, and no visible warning that danger was growing beneath their feet. To the people living around Lake Nyos, life was completely ordinary. To the lake, however, every passing year brought it one step closer to catastrophe. Scientists now believe that something disturbed the deepest layers of the lake that night. It may have been a small landslide. It may have been a sudden shift in temperature. It may even have been that the enormous pressure inside the lake had simply reached its limit. Whatever the trigger, the effect was immediate. The first bubbles of carbon dioxide rose toward the surface, and as they did, they pulled more deep water upward with them. That newly rising water released even more gas, which pulled even more water behind it. Within moments, the process became unstoppable. What had begun as a tiny disturbance deep below the surface transformed into one of the largest natural gas releases ever witnessed by human beings. More than 1 billion cubic meters of carbon dioxide burst out of the lake in an enormous invisible cloud. It was a chain reaction so violent that the water itself erupted upward, sending a massive column of spray hundreds of feet into the air before the gas spilled silently over the edge of the crater. Then gravity took over. Unlike smoke from a fire, carbon dioxide does not naturally rise into the sky. It is heavier than the air we breathe. Instead, it hugged the ground, flowing downhill exactly like water pouring through a valley. It crossed rivers, entered forests, surrounded homes, and filled every low-lying area in its path. There was nowhere to see it, and almost no way to recognize it. People sleeping inside their houses never had the opportunity to react because, by the time they noticed anything unusual, the oxygen around them had already been displaced. Most lost consciousness within minutes. Many never opened their eyes again. Entire families died without understanding what had entered their homes. It remains one of the very few disasters in recorded history where the dead vastly outnumbered those who even realized a disaster was taking place. When the scientific community finally understood exactly what had happened, the relief of solving the mystery quickly gave way to an even more disturbing question. If one lake could secretly store enough gas to kill more than 1,700 people in a single night, how many other lakes around the world were doing exactly the same thing? Researchers immediately began surveying similar volcanic lakes, searching for hidden reservoirs of dissolved carbon dioxide before another community unknowingly built its future beside one. What they discovered confirmed their fears. Lake Nyos was not unique. It was simply the first disaster large enough to force the world to pay attention. That realization triggered an international effort unlike anything attempted before. Engineers and scientists faced an almost impossible challenge. How do you make a lake safe when the danger lies hundreds of feet below the surface and cannot even be seen? The solution they eventually designed was remarkably simple in theory, but incredibly difficult to execute. Long pipes would be lowered into the deepest parts of the lake. Once pumping began, the carbon dioxide-rich water would rise to the surface, releasing its gas in a controlled fountain instead of an uncontrollable explosion. Slowly, year after year, the lake could be depressurized before another deadly eruption became possible. It was an engineering experiment that had never been attempted on this scale, and the lives of thousands of people depended on whether the scientists had understood the disaster correctly. Standing on the shore today, Lake Nyos still looks peaceful. Visitors see calm blue water surrounded by green mountains and find it almost impossible to imagine that this beautiful landscape once became the source of one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 20th century. That contrast is precisely what makes the story so unforgettable. Nature rarely looks dangerous before it reveals its power. Sometimes the greatest threats are not the ones we can hear approaching or see on the horizon. Sometimes they wait silently beneath the surface, hidden in places that appear completely harmless, until one ordinary night changes history forever. The work at Lake Nyos did not end when scientists solved the mystery. In many ways, that was only the beginning. Engineers spent years designing and installing a system capable of releasing the trapped carbon dioxide little by little before it could build up again. Today, long degassing pipes stand in the lake, quietly doing a job that almost nobody notices. Day after day, they allow the invisible gas to escape safely into the atmosphere, reducing the pressure that once turned the lake into a silent killer. The surrounding communities were relocated, monitoring systems were established, and researchers continued to study the lake to ensure that another disaster on the same scale never happens again. It is one of the few places on Earth where science now works every single day to prevent a catastrophe that most people don't even know is possible. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is not the engineering that followed, or the scientific papers that explained what happened. It is the lesson the disaster left behind. Before August of 1986, almost no one imagined that a peaceful lake could hide enough invisible gas to wipe out entire villages overnight. After Lake Nyos, geologists began looking at similar lakes around the world with entirely different eyes. What had once seemed impossible became a recognized natural phenomenon, and that new understanding has almost certainly saved countless lives. Sometimes history changes not because humanity builds something new, but because tragedy forces us to see something that had been there all along. Even today, decades later, Lake Nyos remains strangely beautiful. Its surface reflects the mountains just as it did before that terrible night. Birds fly over its waters. The wind moves quietly across the crater. To someone visiting for the first time, nothing about the landscape suggests that one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 20th century unfolded there. And maybe that is what makes this story so unforgettable. The greatest dangers in our world are not always loud. They do not always arrive with explosions, earthquakes, or towering waves. Sometimes they wait in complete silence, hidden beneath calm water, invisible to everyone around them, until a single moment changes everything. When people think about deadly forces in nature, they imagine hurricanes, volcanoes, earthquakes, or massive floods. Very few would ever think of a quiet mountain lake. Yet, on one ordinary night in Cameroon, an invisible cloud transformed thousands of lives forever and revealed a natural phenomenon that almost nobody believed could exist. It reminds us that our planet is still capable of surprising us in ways that challenge everything we think we know. There are places that appear completely harmless while hiding extraordinary power beneath the surface. Lake Nyos was one of them. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: every person who went to sleep beside that lake believed they would wake up the next morning. They had finished dinner, said goodnight to their families, made plans for the following day, and expected life to continue exactly as it always had. None of them could have imagined that the very air around them would become their greatest enemy. That is why the Lake Nyos disaster continues to fascinate scientists nearly 4 decades later. It wasn't simply a tragedy. It was a reminder that nature does not need to be violent to be devastating. Sometimes it whispers instead of screams. If this story captivated you, remember that every event you heard was reconstructed from documented investigations, scientific research, and eyewitness accounts. The world is filled with real stories that sound impossible until you discover they actually happened. And some of the most unbelievable stories are still waiting to be told.